Okay, so let's talk about war photography from the 19th century. Now, when we talk about war photographs specifically, we hardly see action shots like we see today from war photos. Um, Taking photos back then required long shutter speeds. For students that are not into photography classes and don't really know manual camera functions, shutter speeds control the amount of time light is getting recorded onto the film, onto the coated sheets or the glass plates. So think of it as a window shade. Now, the faster you open the shade and shut it, the least amount of light is going into the room. But if you slowly open a shade and slowly close it, more light is going to enter the room, right? So think of that. So they were not able to have faster shutter speeds. They had slow shutter speeds. So anything in front of the camera moving would be blurry. So let's talk about the Crimean War. The Crimean War lasted about from 1854 to 1856, and it was between Britain, France, and Turkey against Russia on the Black Sea. It was the first well-documented war with photographs, so it's very important. So we're going to go over a bunch of photography during this presentation. So let's talk about Roger Fenton. Now, Roger Fenton first studied law in London, but while he was studying, he also wanted to paint. So he was trained as a painter in London and Paris, and he exhibited his paintings in those towns. He also helped found a drawing school that gave evening instructions to working men in London. So it gave them a chance to take a class in the evening and learn how to paint. So he was very active in the arts, and he worked alongside with many French photographers, such as Gustave Legray and Henri Lessec. And because he worked with those photographers, mainly, many people think that he got that interest, that spark in photography from them. Fenton's photographic career was brilliant, but it was very brief. His subject matter covered a broad range. He was a photographer for almost about 12 years, and he became one of the founders of the Photographic Society in London. He also photographed the British royal family, and in 1852 he made what are believed to be the first photographs of Russia and Kremlin. In 1853, the British Museum invited him to document some of their collections, which is kind of a big deal. His photographs of Crimea in 1855 were the first large-scale photographic documentation of a war. And in addition, Fenton made also landscapes, architectural studies of historical landmarks, etc. Fenton exhibited and sold his photographs, but he eventually grew disdainful of the commercialization of photography and how things were changing. Everyone was able to get a camera and kind of learn the craft, and I don't think he really liked that so much. And in October 1862, he suddenly gave it up. And he sold off his negatives and equipment, and he returned to the practice of law. So at this point, though, Fenton was already an accomplished and respected photographer. And he covered the war. So that was kind of a big deal. He showed stark, empty battlefields where many lost their lives. So his work was published in newspaper reports, and his work really showed the impact of the war to the general public for the first time. So this photo right here, which is an iconic photo called Valley of the Shadow of Death, and there's a little bit of controversy around it. So in the one on the top, you see how there's cannonballs all through the road on the right. So look closely. And on the one on the bottom, which is, they're not really sure who took it, if it was him or just a study taken by him for the picture on the top. Now, you see on the bottom, there's not really many cannonballs at all on that road. So people think that he moved the cannonballs on that road for a more dramatic photograph. He gave a little bit more artistic license. He moved things a little bit. So I love this photo. This is a photo of his photo assistant, Marcus Sparling. Now this is his this is Fenton's photographic van. So this is where he would develop his plates. This is where he would develop the film and expose it and get it ready for the next shot. So this is kind of a portable darkroom. And it's interesting. It's light safe, so it's completely dark when you go in there. And it just really, it's great to see how they did this. So although they weren't able to take actual scenes of battle because people were moving, Fenton focused much of his work on the sidelines. He took pictures of the soldiers, either resting, eating, preparing for the next battle, etc. So despite the high temperatures on the battlefields, and he actually broke several ribs in a fall, he also had cholera, and he became depressed after seeing all the carnage he was witnessing around him. But he did make over 350 usable large format negatives. So we have a great representation of the war from him. Nevertheless, sales were not good. So not that many sales of his pictures to newspapers, etc., like he thought he would have. So he didn't get so much commercial success, but he did get the respect of other photographers. So now let's talk about the Civil War and the photography of it. So more than 1,400 photographers made images connected with the conflict. And during the time of the Civil War, there was such a demand for photographs. And the business of making and distributing them boomed. People wanted to see what was going on. Like in our last presentation, those carte de visites, they were so popular. And it was customary for soldiers to go to get a portrait studio, to get one before heading off to war so they can give their family, loved ones, etc., a picture of themselves. Especially just knowing that they might not come back from war, come back from battle, that they had this portrait taken of them. It was kind of a relief for them. So there was three major photographers of the Civil War. We have Mathew Brady. He was the main photographer, meaning that we have the most images captured by him. Now we also have Alexander Gardner, and he was, for a bit anyway, Mathew Brady's studio manager. We also have Timothy O'Sullivan, and he worked in Mathew Brady's studio. So they're all connected, and these three photographers created the most important photographs of the Civil War. So Mathew Brady kind of conceived the idea to create a comprehensive photographic record of the war. And he actually arranged for teams of photographers to travel with the Union armies to get these shots. So let's talk about Mathew Brady. First, he was known as a portrait artist, right? But he became the most famous American photographer of the 1800s because of the Civil War's studio images. Like other photographers in the mid 1850s, he opened a studio on Broadway in New York City. It was very popular. Through flattery and determination, he lured notable subjects, okay, into his studio, very famous people. And after the election of 1848, Brady then traveled to Washington to photograph political figures. So over time, he built a monumental archive that included presidents, senators, congressmen, Supreme Court justices, actors, writers, businessmen, clergy, scientists, artists, military men, and entrepreneurs. But at the outbreak of the Civil War, Brady obtained permission for his staff of photographers, the ones that he compiled to work with him. Um, he wanted to follow the tracks of the Union Army. So all these photographers that he compiled, they worked under the direction of Alexander Gardner. So Alexander Gardner, started as Brady's Washington studio manager. So once they went into the war time and into the war zones, he continued that role, taking pictures but also being the studio manager. So this is a very famous photograph by Mathew Brady of General Robert E. Lee. And this portrait was taken 7 days after General Lee and the Confederate Army surrendered. So here we see a technique called combination printing. Now this is before Photoshop. So they were able to still do amazing things. They merged 3 negatives sometimes or more to one print. So here we have Brady's Fisher Hill in Virginia, and you see tents, you see troops gathered, taking a break, discussing the next battle, let's say. Now on the right, we see Brady's photograph of Major General Alexander McDowell McCook, and on the lower left, we see Brady's photograph of General Ulysses S. Grant. Now what he did in the next photograph, so hold on and look. Here we see the photographs blended together. So what he did was he put one negative on top of another negative, exposed parts of it to light, and created a final negative that comprised of all 3 pictures. So what we have here is that battlefield in the background with the tents, the encampment, we have soldiers sitting down, and then we have General Alexander McDowell's horse and his body. But then we have General Ulysses S. Grant's head on the general. So we have 2 generals put together into one. One stately looking photo. The horse is right in the center of the frame, and we could tell that we can't tell this was produced like that, right? It looks like it was taken just how it is. It's pretty impressive. So now let's talk about Alexander Gardner. Now, he was an idealistic young reporter. He was a newspaper editor in Glasgow, Scotland. And he dreamed of forming a semi-socialistic colony somewhere in the Americas. Now, he saw the unspoiled wilderness as this untamed territory that he could set up this wonderful utopian kind of place. He selected a place in Iowa, actually. And he actually sent some of his family and friends to live there. But he never joined them. Instead, he went to New York, and he remained in New York. Very interesting, right? And in New York, he met the celebrated American photographer Mathew Brady that we just discussed. And they became acquainted, they were friends, and he slowly became Brady's assistant. For 7 years, he was his assistant. And then he was the manager of Brady's Washington, D.C. gallery until the Civil War broke out in 1861, and then he took photos along with Brady. So take a look at this slide. This is named Home of a Rebel Sharpshooter, Devil's Den. Now, take a look at this soldier and unfortunately where he died and how his positioning is. And in the next slide, we'll talk more. So here we see the same dead soldier that we saw in the previous slide. But after taking this photograph, the photograph before anyway, Gardner and his assistant actually dragged the body to a more picturesque location called the Devil's Den. I don't know, they just felt like it was more a better looking photograph, moving the body. As I said before, with the other photograph of the cannonballs, photographers took a little bit of artistic license. They moved things around a little bit. And in this photo, we also see a type of weapon. We see a gun right here on the lower right, but it was not a weapon that was used by sharpshooters. So we're kind of thinking that it was probably a prop used by Gardner. He stuck it in there. So Gardner is well known for his Civil War photographs, but as well he was known for his portraits of Abraham Lincoln. He also took pictures of the conspirators of Lincoln's assassination, and we're going to see that in the next couple slides. He had a studio based in Washington, D.C., and he photographed Lincoln twice as many times as any other photographer did. So here we see Alexander Gardner's picture of Lewis Powell. He was a Lincoln assassination conspirator, and you can see that he's already been arrested. He's shackled in this photo. So here we see the actual execution of the conspirators, the people that assassinated Lincoln. So here we have Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Herold, and George Atzerodt. This was taken July 7th, 1865. So now we see photographs by Timothy O'Sullivan, and he began his photography career as an apprentice to Matthew Brady. As I said, they're all connected, all three of these photographers. Now he started in Matthew Brady's Fulton Street, New York gallery, but then he moved on to Washington, D.C., and in the D.C. branch, he was managed by Alexander Gardner, who we talked about a few slides ago. After that, O'Sullivan joined Brady's team of Civil War photographers. He had many of his images were included in Gardner's photographic sketchbook of the war, which was a published book of Civil War photographs, the first of the kind. He built a reputation on images that conveyed destruction and the power of modern warfare, modern during the time that he was in, obviously. And he, after the war and after photographing all of that, the government actually commissioned him to do a lot of expeditions, a lot of surveys of different parts of the country, on different geological issues, etc. So he made a living over that for a long time, and his photographs are really valued for the rich beauty of them. He ended up dying, unfortunately, when he was only 42 years old of tuberculosis. So let's look at Dr. Reed Bontekoe. Now, he was a physician, but he was also a soldier, and he was from New York. He took his camera to the battlefield. He photographed wounded soldiers. He also documented treatments, surgeries, and working conditions of the physicians. So he produced a collection of medical photography, and it's believed to be the first collection of its kind. I'm going to show you some work in a minute. He even photographed a pile of severed feet, which he titled A Morning's Work, in a graphic representation of the alarming regularity of amputation in Civil War hospitals. Here we see gunshot wounds. On the next couple of slides, you're going to see arrows. Those are illustrated by him, showing the impact and the direction of the wounds. Here we have work by Simon Norfolk. He's a contemporary photographer. I always like to conclude our presentations with some present day photography that relates. He was born in 1963. He's still alive. And he's a contemporary photographer that documents the aftermath of war. And he was born in Nigeria in 1963. He was very well educated and went to university in England. He finished at Oxford, and he got a degree in philosophy and sociology. He took a documentary photography course in Wales, and he worked for far-left publications, specializing in work on anti-racist activities and fascist groups. In 1994, he gave up photojournalism in favor of landscape photography. And his book, for most of it, I have no words, Genocide, Landscape, and Memory, are about places that have witnessed genocide. And it was published in 1998, and it was exhibited at many, many venues, including the Imperial War Museum in London, which is a big deal, and the Holocaust Museum in Texas. So he photographed the war in Afghanistan in 2001. He published that as Afghanistan Chronotopia, and it won the European Publishers Award for Photography. In 2004, though, Norfolk won the Infinity Award from the International Center of Photography in New York, ICP. They have a museum as well. I believe they just reopened, actually. And he also has the most recent book, Bleed, which is about the aftermath of the war in Bosnia. So it was published in 2005, and his work appears regularly in the New York Times and in the Guardian. So he photographs and documents the aftermath. He also tries not to show dead bodies. He focuses mainly on the destruction of the landscape and its architecture, and what's left of the architecture anyway. He shows how life continues on in these areas that have been devastated by war.